So today and tomorrow we will be discussing Buddhism, Buddhist epistemology, and I have divided it into two parts. Today I will discuss Nagarjuna's epistemology, and tomorrow that of Dingnag and Dharmakirti. Nagarjuna's epistemology, Nagarjuna's philosophy in general is very difficult to grasp, and it is very difficult to bring out a very consistent interpretation of it, and there have been many attempts to interpret Nagarjuna's philosophy, and there have been many controversies on that, and particularly because it talks about shunyata, that is emptiness. Everything is empty, everything is shunya. That is what he says, and that is his supposed to be his main, so to say, claim. It has been discarded by many Astika systems, and even of course other Nastika systems, maybe like Jainism and others. They simply discard it because, after all, Nagarjuna says that nothing exists, so it is regarded as a kind of doctrine of abhava, doctrine of nothing exists, everything is absent, like that. And so generally nobody bothers to go into details of what Nagarjuna wants to say. Nobody means from Astika side particularly. So Shankaracharya, for example, simply says that it is not worthy of consideration at all in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya, in his commentary on Brahma Sutra. Interestingly, one of the Maharashtrian saints, Jnaneshwara, in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, in the beginning there are salutation verses to Ganapati, and there he describes that Lord Ganapati in terms of various darshanas. So there he says that the Shunyavada Siddhanta is Khandita Danta of Ganesha, that is, it is broken tooth of Ganesha. So the word Khandita has, there is a pun on that. Khandita means refuted and Khandita means broken. So it is, according to him, it is already refuted. So it is something like internally contradictory. It is a case of self-contradiction, and therefore it is not worthy of consideration. So here what I am going to try to do is to give a kind of consistent interpretation and to make a case of what Nagarjuna wants to say. In the morning part, I will be mainly talking about the method he uses, that is what is called Prasanga method, which is similar to what is called reductio ad absurdum method. And in the second part, that is in the afternoon session, I will be talking about the skepticism, his skeptical arguments. So yesterday we discussed Nyaya conception of knowledge and classification of knowledge. Historically, Nyaya theory was the first systematic theory of knowledge in India, which was presented along with and as suitable to the realistic metaphysics of Vaisheshika system. Vaisheshika system of Kanada had given a scheme of 6 categories which they called Padartha, in terms of which a mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive picture of the world could be given. So this was the claim of Vaisheshikas, that if we accept these 6 and later on 7 categories, then we give a complete picture of the world, that is, these categories are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. That was the claim. So these categories are substance, that is Dravya. There are 9 substances, 5 elements, then time, space, souls and minds. Then second category is quality, that is Guna. Then they are 24 in number, They include sensible qualities of material substances, qualities of the soul, then qualities like conjunction, disjunction, that is physical conjunction, physical disjunction, they are also regarded as qualities of the substances. Then number, size, nearness, remoteness, heaviness, viscosity, etc. And motion, karma, any movement is regarded, is something real, and it is one of the categories. And universals, samanya, jati, particularity, vishesha, particularities of ultimate substances, and inherence, inseparability, relation. We have already seen these things, but I am only presenting them in an ordered way. Now, padartha means denotative meaning of a word. Use of the word padartha, padasya arthaha padartha, the denotative meaning of a word. So, use of the word padartha for ontological categories indicates the isomorphism between language and reality. So, corresponding to every word, there must be something in reality, and corresponding to reality, everything in reality, there should be something in our language which can describe it. Vaisheshikas call these categories also as prameya, which means knowable. In this way, there is isomorphism between language, knowledge, and reality. Vaisheshikas believe that every meaningful word in our language refers to something real. This claim primarily applied to positive expressions in our language. Later on, it was extended to negative expressions. A negative expression also must refer to something in the world. This something was called absence, abhava. By introducing the category of absence, the ontological picture of the world was made complete. Nyaya system accepted this picture of the world and developed epistemology in support of this. Both Buddhism and Jainism were critical about this approach in different ways. And although Buddhism in general was critical about Nyaya Vaisheshika approach, within Buddhism we have diversity of approaches. Today and tomorrow I will deal with Buddhist approaches. Today I will discuss Nagarjuna's approach, and tomorrow the approach of Dingnag and Dharmakirti. Day after tomorrow I will turn to Jainism. So why was Buddhism critical about Nyaya? Nyayikas believed that whatever we cognize or we talk about is a part and parcel of the world. What we cognize, even in an erroneous cognition, though it may be a misplaced real, it is real. This is their idea behind their theory of error called seeing the things otherwise, anyatha khyati. Buddha's teaching, on the other hand, contends that the reality as we commonly cognize it and the way we describe it in language involves many things which are not there but are constructed or fabricated by our mind. These mental constructions are called vikalpa. The theories of error attributed to Buddhists are seeing the unreal, asatkyati, and seeing our own mind as the external object, atmakhyati. Our mind should be free from mental constructs in order to see reality as it is. This general principle is accepted in all schools of Buddhism. These schools can be arranged in the order of acceptance and denial of what is empirically given and its participation in knowledge. So, there is one school called Sarvastivada or Vaibhashika, according to which the external phenomena are real and perceptible, but eternality and substantiality we superimpose on them is unreal. That is, they have this doctrine of anatta, anatmavada, which is also translated as non-substantiality of everything. There is no substance. So, there is no substance inside, which is called Atman, and there is no substance outside in the things also. So, this is the anatmavada, and anityata, that is, everything is impermanent. So, eternality as well as substantiality is denied even in this Sarvastivada Vaibhashika school. Then we come to Sautrantika school, according to which external phenomena exist only in the present, and they are not perceived, but they are inferred. So external objects, they are not directly perceived according to them, but they cause the cognition, and because of that the cognition assumes the form of the object, and on the basis of the form of the object we infer that corresponding to the form that the cognition has assumed, my consciousness has assumed, there must be something outside there. So external objects are inferred according to Sautrantika school. Then Yogachara, according to which only consciousness exists and external world is false projection of mind. And lastly Madhyamika, according to which all things, whether internal or external, are empty, shunya, that is devoid of own nature. That is, the word for that is swabhava. They are without any swabhava, which can be also translated as essence. The things are without any essence, without any own nature. All identifications, cognitions and descriptions are mental constructions. Each school tries to derive its respective position from Buddha's sayings, but also tries to give reasons for its position. So every school claims that their views are derived from what Buddha himself said. And also they independently they give arguments for proving that. Now Nagarjuna, Acharya Nagarjuna, the founder of Madhyamika school of Buddhism, lived in the second half of the 2nd century AD. He is said to have composed not less than 15 works, the most famous out of them being Madhyamaka Shastra, or what is also called Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and Vigraha Vyavartani. There are many other texts, but I am mainly concentrating on these two. Here we will discuss his position with special reference to these two texts. The position that Nagarjuna tries to develop through these texts can be called anti-essentialist position. Anti-essentialism is the translation of Niswabhavavad, the view that things have no swabhava. Swabhava means the nature of a thing which makes the thing what it is. The Sarvastivada school of Buddhism was the most realistic school which accepted various kinds of entities with well-defined natures or essences. So it was a Swabhavavadi school among Buddhists. The school accepted the existence of entities such as time, space, mind, matter, and the person consisting of 5 aggregates. It also accepted relational pairs and trios such as cause and effect, actions and fruits, knower and knowable, action, its agent and object, and past, present and future. In his work Madhyamaka Shastra, Nagarjuna picked up such entities and relational complexes, and by critically examining them, arrived at the conclusion that none of them exists by itself. So there is no cause-effect relationship. I mean, you cannot say that cause is cause by its very nature, and with reference to relation between sense organ and objects, and the so-called impermanent entities also, the impermanence also cannot be regarded as swabhava, the true nature of the impermanent things, and so on and so forth. He also examined the concepts of existence and non-existence and pointed out that the negation of essential existence does not lead to essential non-existence, and that non-essentiality is beyond existence and non-existence. So something exists essentially, if we deny that, then that does not mean that it must be non-existent essentially. It is possible, the third alternative is that it is neither existent essentially nor non-existent essentially, because it has no essence at all. Though Nagarjuna in Madhyamaka Shastra mainly focused on the views presented by the Sarvastivada school of Buddhism, his anti-essentialist criticism was not restricted to that. Through the views of Sarvastivada school, he was examining the essentialist views in general. It is our common natural tendency to essentialize things, to attribute existence or non-existence and other essential characteristics to them. Like Sarvastivada school of Buddhism, Nyaya and Vaisheshika schools of the orthodox Indian philosophy exhibited the same essentialist tendency in its ontology and epistemology. it is not known whether Vaisheshika Sutra of Kanada was available to Nagarjuna, because there are no such references found. But Nyaya Sutra of Akshapada Gautama was definitely available to him. In fact, Nagarjuna wrote a rejoinder in aphorismic style to Nyaya aphorisms, which was called Vaidalya Sutra, tearing aphorisms. In this work, Nagarjuna criticizes all the 16 categories of Nyaya Sutra. For rejecting various essentialist views, which according to him are dogmatic views or drishti. Drishti is another important term which is used in Buddhism, in Pali ditti, which means dogmatic views. So it is used in two ways actually. The word ditti or drishti is used, it simply means view. The word drishti itself means view. And sometimes we will find that Buddha talked about a right view and wrong view. That is sammaditthi and michhaditti, samyak drishti, mithya drishti. But sometimes he would say that all drishtis are mithya in a way. That is, all drishtis are worthy of rejection. So any view is in a way a dogmatic view, that is, we are just thinking that something is the case. We are not really knowing, you are not having the insight into the true nature of things, you are only thinking about it in a certain way. So any view is worthy of getting rid of. I mean, that is, so in these two ways we find the word drishti used in Buddhist literature. Here in Madhyamika Buddhism, Nagarjuna uses the word drishti in the second sense, in the sense in which all drishtis are worthy of rejection. And according to him, Buddha also gave the same message, that sarva drishti prahana, abandoning all views. So all drishtis are in a sense dogmatic views. Nagarjuna uses a peculiar method. So in order to reject all views, he uses the peculiar method called prasanga paddhati, roughly the method of reductio ad absurdum. In this context, prasanga literally means calamity or unacceptable consequence, undesirable condition, and that is the meaning of prasanga. And rejecting a view by prasanga method means rejecting a view by pointing out the unacceptable consequence it will lead to. So if you accept so given the view V, so for example, suppose V is the view, then if you accept V, then such and such consequence will follow, which is not desirable, therefore view cannot be accepted. So it is a proof, it is the method of negative, method of refutation rather than proving something. I mean, he does not make any positive claim that such and such thing exists or such and such is the case because so and so, but he is taking up a view and then rejecting it by pointing out that if you accept this view, then these are the consequences. While using this method, Nagarjuna generally followed the following procedure. So let us suppose that V is the essentialist view which Nagarjuna wants to reject, then Nagarjuna would analyze V in terms of alternative formulations. That is, V can be understood or presented in various ways, say V1, V2, V3, V4. And generally these 4 ways or 3 ways are all possible ways. And then if every possible formulation is rejected, then the view, namely V, will be automatically rejected. That is his that is the method that he uses. Now suppose that exactly 4 alternative formulations are possible, then Nagarjuna would consider them one by one and bring out the unacceptable consequences each one will lead to. In this way, all the alternative formulations of the view V stand rejected. This leads to the rejection of the original view, namely V. Can one negate all alternative positions? Can one negate a proposition as well as its negation? This is, it seems so this is a question, that is, suppose in any there are 4 possibilities, then can we reject all the 4 possibilities? Generally what we say is that out of these 4 you can reject 3 at the most, and ultimately one possibility you have to accept. It's now this strategy or policy of Nagarjuna can be explained in terms of the distinction between internal negation and external negation. So it seems possible, if we follow Bertrand Russell's distinction between internal negation and external negation, the internal negation of the statement P will be, for example, the present king of France is wise, and its internal negation will be the present king of France is unwise. So let us write it as P prime. Both the statements, namely P and P prime, imply the existence of some being called the present king of France. But the external negation, it is not the case that P does not imply the existence of the present king of France. It is possible to negate P as well as P prime externally, which does not involve any contradiction. So now, I mean, this is one of the interpretations of Nagarjuna's policy of negating all alternatives. That is, all these different alternatives are based on certain presupposition, and therefore it is possible to negate all the alternatives. And in this way people have tried to defend Nagarjuna's method. For example, B.K. Matilal has tried to give a defense of Nagarjuna in this way. I mean, some of the examples of his application of this method. In the first chapter of Madhyamaka Shastra, Nagarjuna examines the concept of pratyaya. It is a common belief, pratyaya means causal condition. It is a common belief that an effect arises from causal conditions. Now, given that a thing arises from something, Nagarjuna holds there are 4 mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive formulations. A thing arises from itself, a thing arises from other things, that is something else, a thing arises from itself as well as others, and a thing arises from neither itself nor other things. And then he shows how each alternative leads to an unacceptable consequence. By applying this, I mean, for this we may have to read the chapter, but it is not possible. So I will just leave it at this level. That, I mean, he rejects each alternative by pointing out some difficulties in it. So by applying this reductio ad absurdum method, he denies all alternatives because common on the basis that the common presupposition that things arise is not acceptable. In the second chapter of Madhyamaka Shastra, Nagarjuna examines the concept of motion. It is our common presupposition that things move. Movement implies that a thing reaches a point in space through motion. About the point being reached through motion, there are 3 and only 3 alternative possibilities. The point which is reached is being reached. The point which is not reached is being reached. The point which is neither reached nor not reached, but is being reached, is being reached. Now, Nagarjuna, by showing how each alternative leads to some unacceptable consequence, denies all alternatives because he wants to deny their common presupposition that there is motion. So ultimately he tries to show that there is nothing which can be called motion. Gata, Agata, Pariksha, that is the title of the chapter. Gata and Agata, gone to and not gone to. At the most general level, Nagarjuna applies this method to 2 basic ontological categories, namely is and is not. Nagarjuna argues that to say that a thing exists is one extreme, and to say that the thing does not exist is another extreme. Attributing existence to a thing as its essence leads to treating it as eternal. Here Nagarjuna seems to have the following argument in mind, that is how existence leads to eternality. If you accept that a thing exists, really exists, essentially exists, if a thing really exists, then it must be the own nature of the thing that it exists, swabhav. But own nature cannot be transcended. A thing cannot lose its own nature. From one and to above, the thing which really exists cannot lose its existence. So the existent thing cannot cease to exist, hence it is eternal. On the other hand, if we say that a thing does not exist, then it would lead to absolute non-existence of the thing. Such a thing would never come into being, it would never appear. Hence the language of existence leads to eternalism, shashvatavad, and the language of non-existence leads to annihilationism or nihilism, what is called uchchedavad. And these two terms are used in early Buddhism, that is Pali Buddhism, that Shashvatavad and Uchchedavad both are to be rejected, and Buddha, according to Nagarjuna, avoids both these extremes. And therefore, this the idea of middle path, why Buddha's view is called middle path, it has a reference to that. It avoids both these extremes, namely eternalism and annihilationism. Through the examination of different alternatives and more generally through the examination of existence and non-existence, Nagarjuna suggests that the things in this world are neither to this nor to that end, they are in the middle. The middle character of things in this way is analytically related to its essencelessness, nisvabhavata, or emptiness. Nagarjuna's conception of emptiness, especially as identified with the middle character, has an important implication to the development of Buddhism. In early Buddhism, the middle way, which characterized the Buddha's approach to life in general, amounted to avoid two practical extremes called the way of sensuous pleasures and the way of self-mortification. So, in Pali literature, that is in early Buddhist literature, when we talk of Buddha's middle path, Buddha generally does not talk of these two extremes, namely eternalism and annihilationism, but he talks about two practical extremes. One is that running after pleasures, sensuous pleasures, and the other extreme is self-mortification. And he says that I try to avoid both these extremes, both these practical extremes, and go by the middle path. The early Buddhist literature also refers to two extremes as eternalism. So occasionally we have references to these two extremes also as eternalism and annihilationism. But the meanings of these terms are different from what Nagarjuna gave to them. According to the early literature, eternalism means belief in the eternal things such as soul, and annihilationism means the belief that our good or bad actions simply cease without giving any results. That is, not believing in karma and rebirth and the fruits of actions. That is regarded as the meaning of Uchchedavada, that is annihilationism. That is, our actions just get annihilated without giving any fruits. That was the idea of annihilationism in early Buddhism. And that there are some eternal things such as soul, that was the meaning of eternalism in early Buddhism. Nagarjuna understood eternalism and annihilationism in a more general and theoretical sense. Accordingly, belief in the existence of things led to eternalism, and belief in the non-existence of things led to annihilationism. Now, the middle way means not attributing either existence or non-existence to anything. This middle way was a metaphysical and theoretical middle rather than a practical and moral one. Nagarjuna's philosophical position differs from Theravada position in that whereas the latter stands for primacy of the practical, whereas the former, that is Theravada, stands for primacy of the practical, whereas Nagarjuna's philosophical position stands for primacy of the theoretical. This does not mean, however, that Nagarjuna was unconcerned with the practical problem of suffering. Only he treated the problem basically as a part of a theoretical, metaphysical problem. Hence, the solution too is theoretical or post-theoretical. It is believed that the theoretical insight will automatically change the practical form of life. Nagarjuna seems to believe that craving is not operative only at emotive or practical level of life, but even at theoretical cognitive level. Accordingly, even our language and thought, which refers to existence and non-existence of things, is a form of craving. Craving in this sense is inbuilt in our thought and language. The practical craving out of which we try to attain something and get rid of something becomes secondary, an outcome of the primary theoretical craving in this framework. Now, in traditional Buddhism, when they talk of craving, they talk of three types of craving. One is called Bhavatrushna, Vibhavatrushna, and Kamatrushna. Kamatrushna is craving for sensuous pleasures. Bhavatrushna means the desire for being reborn again and again, that is continuation of one's own existence, and Vibhavatrushna is desire for destruction. Now, so these are all practical in nature, whereas Nagarjuna in one of the chapters of Madhyamaka Karika so to say transforms the concept of Bhavatrushna into Bhavatrushna. That is, in traditional Buddhism it is craving for continuation of existence, but according to Nagarjuna, to think that things exist itself is a kind of craving. So it is Bhavatrushna. Bhava means existence. So craving, it is not craving for existence, but the craving which expresses itself in the form of thinking that there is existence. So to think that something exists itself is a kind of craving, and to think that something does not exist, that is Vibhavatrushna, that is craving for destruction, he understands as craving which thinks that things do not exist. So to say that thing exists or to think that thing exists itself is a kind of craving, out of which the practical craving arises. Practical craving is just the outcome of this basic theoretical craving, that out of this craving we think that things exist, some of the things exist, some of the things are non-existent. So what is non-existent should come into existence, or what is existent should not continue to exist, and all that is just the outcome of the basic theoretical craving. And then if we are free from this craving, if we don't we are free from our belief that things exist or things are non-existent, then the secondary craving, namely desire for things in the world or aversion about the things in the world, that will automatically cease to exist. That is that seems to be the Nagarjuna's strategy, so to say, in understanding craving. So craving in this sense is inbuilt in our thought and language. The practical craving out of which we try to attain something and get rid of something becomes secondary, an outcome of the primary theoretical craving in this framework. Now we come to some logical issues. Nagarjuna applied Prasanga method for refuting all types of views, and this gives rise to some logical issues. One important issue is whether his universal application of the method violates the laws of classical two-valued logic. We have seen that while applying Prasanga method to any particular view, Nagarjuna considers all alternative formulations of the view, so that negation of all the formulations amounts to negation of the original view. One of the problems with this method is that in its application it violates laws of logic. Nagarjuna's method of all alternatives sometimes assumes the form of four alternatives, namely yes, no, both yes and no, and neither yes nor no. And this is called popularly called Chatushkoti, the four alternatives. According to the classical two-valued logic, if the alternative, namely yes, is negated, then the alternative, namely no, should be accepted, and vice versa. Denying both will amount to violation of the law of non-contradiction. Nagarjuna, sorry, actually accepting both will amount to violation of law of non-contradiction, and denying both will amount to a violation of the law of excluded middle. I should correct that. Nagarjuna not only does that, he even considers the alternative yes and no, and neither yes nor no as genuine alternatives, which are obvious violations of the laws of non-contradiction and excluded middle. One can argue here that this charge of the violation of the laws of logic can be answered by explaining the contradictory alternatives in a different way. One may claim that the global application of unrestricted application of the Prasanga method of refutation is meant for questioning the presupposition which is common to all the alternatives. We have explained this by distinguishing between internal negation and external negation. But such an explanation is not satisfactory. The point can be substantiated as follows. We have referred to Nagarjuna's examination of motion, for example. That is the second chapter of Madhyamaka Shastra, through which he shows that our basic assumption that there is motion is faulty. However, Nagarjuna's argument does not stop there, because denial of motion leads to its contrary view that since there is no motion, things must be static in nature. If there is no motion at all, then naturally everything is static, nothing moves. However, Nagarjuna applies this Prasanga method to this assumption also. By applying the method to inertia, he shows that what is applicable to motion is equally applicable to inertia. Now it is possible to deny both. Now is it possible to deny both motion and inertia without contradiction? One might argue that Nagarjuna can deny both because both are based on another common presupposition which he wants to deny. The common presupposition is that things exist. Nagarjuna applies the reductio ad absurdum method to this assumption also. But in the 15th chapter of his work, he denies the notions such as self-existence, other existence, existence. Now, denial of the presupposition that things exist would lead one to accept its negation that things are non-existent. And this is actually the charge which opponents of Buddhism level against Nagarjuna, that after all what he is proving is that everything is non-existent. But Nagarjuna does not accept this logical consequence either. After denying existence, he also denies non-existence. So this leads to the next dilemma, according to which things are neither existent nor non-existent. It seems obvious that one cannot deny existence and non-existence. That is, it is not possible, I think, to point out another presupposition which is at the basis of both existence and non-existence. So it seems obvious that one cannot deny existence and non-existence both without transgressing the laws of logic such as non-contradiction, the excluded middle, and double negation. Here we can say that application of Prasanga method, that is reductio ad absurdum method itself, does not challenge or break the laws of logic. But if the method is used universally or globally to deny even existence and non-existence, then it would amount to breach of the laws of logic such as non-contradiction and excluded middle, and this is what we see in Nagarjuna's argumentation. Though Nagarjuna is generally arguing within the limits of classical logic and is adhering to laws of logic, he does not restrict the scope of this argumentation but stretches it to the limiting cases where he cannot remain within the limits of classical logic. Just as we see in Nagarjuna violating the laws such as non-contradiction and excluded middle, we find him violating the law of identity as well. We have seen that while examining motion, Nagarjuna considers and denies three alternatives. The point which is reached is being reached, the point which is not reached is being reached, the point which is being reached is being reached. That was the third alternative. Here we are concerned with the third alternative. It is an identity statement, it is negation of an yes, it is an identity statement which is a tautology. Nagarjuna criticizes this alternative also on the ground that it implies two motions. If a point is being reached, how can it be being reached again? So he is treating a tautological statement as a significant statement or an indicative sentence, and if we treat tautology as an indicative statement, then certainly there will be a problem. Just as, of course, Nagarjuna's transgression of classical logic is not based on his love for playing with logic or construction of a new logic, but it is a consequence of his critical attitude to logic. So I should not take it as just violation of logic because he did not understand logic or whatever, but he is deliberately expressing his uncomfortableness with logic. Nagarjuna is not comfortable with logic because he is not comfortable with language as a whole. Now this is actually the point that I want to make. Nagarjuna is critical not only about language but also about thought. So language, thought, they are governed by logic, and denial of logic is possible if you deny language as a whole. In fact, this dissatisfaction about language, thought and logic go together. That is because the three mechanisms are coextensive. As soon as you speak, logic becomes applicable. As soon as you think, logic becomes applicable. Logic will not be applicable if you don't speak at all or you don't think at all. Language and thought, which are governed by laws of logic, give us conventional truth. In Nagarjuna's framework, he distinguishes between conventional truth and ultimate truth, that is Samvriti Satya and Paramartha Satya. The whole of Samvriti Satya, the conventional truth, is governed by language, logic, thought and so on and so forth. Nagarjuna's criticism of logic, language, thought and logic is the offshoot of his radical criticism of the conventional truth. Hence, Nagarjuna sometimes asks us not to construct anything mentally, not to speak, not to think. Buddha regarded certain metaphysical questions as unanswerable, avyakruta, because they were based on false presuppositions, and Buddha observed silence over them. Nagarjuna generalized this approach and regarded all questions as unanswerable and made a plea for silence over them. But this silence was not supposed to be oral or external, but mental and intellectual, based on total resistance to make any ontological commitment, whether positive or negative. So I just, okay, if there are questions.